When people imagine World War II, they usually picture endless columns of tanks, roaring aircraft, and vast armies clashing head-on. What almost no one imagines is a group of painters, sculptors, sound technicians, and radio nerds quietly shaping the battlefield with air pumps and imagination. Yet that's exactly where the story of the Ghost Army begins. At a moment when Allied commanders understood that raw firepower alone wouldn't be enough, deception became a weapon in its own right. The question wasn't just how to defeat the enemy, but how to mislead them so completely that they would defeat themselves. Out of that thinking came a unit so strange it sounded like a joke. A force whose primary equipment wasn't rifles or artillery, but inflatable tanks. This unit, officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, was assembled with a very specific purpose: to create convincing illusions of massive Allied forces where almost none actually existed. The men chosen for this task weren't typical soldiers. Many were recruited from art schools, advertising agencies, theater backgrounds, and sound engineering programs. Some would later become famous artists and designers. But at the time, their job was simple and incredibly risky: trick the German army into seeing, hearing, and believing something that wasn't there. And they had to do it close enough to the front lines that if the illusion failed, they'd be in serious trouble. The inflatable tanks were the most visually striking part of the operation. From the ground, they looked absurd. Rubber shapes hauled around by a handful of men, light enough to be picked up and repositioned in minutes. But from the air, where German reconnaissance planes gathered much of their intelligence, these decoys looked shockingly real. The Ghost Army didn't just scatter them randomly. They studied how real armored divisions were arranged, how vehicles were spaced, and how tracks appeared in the dirt. They even drove jeeps back and forth to create convincing tread marks, carefully choreographing the scene so that any aerial photograph told the same story. A powerful force was assembling here. But the trick went far beyond what could be seen. The Ghost Army understood that modern warfare relied on multiple layers of intelligence, and so their illusion had to exist on every level at once. While inflatable tanks sat silently in fields, sound engineers were nearby playing recordings through massive speakers. These weren't generic noises. They were carefully constructed soundscapes of armored columns moving, trucks grinding over roads, soldiers shouting orders, and engines idling through the night. The sounds were adjusted based on terrain and distance, so that German listening posts would hear exactly what they expected to hear from a unit of that size. At the same time, radio operators were busy flooding the airwaves with fake communications. They copied the habits of real units, including specific radio slang, message timing, and even individual operators' fists, the unique rhythms of their Morse code transmissions, to German signal intelligence. It appeared that a large, organized formation was active and communicating constantly. Visual evidence, audio confirmation, and intercepted radio traffic all reinforced each other. Any single clue might have been dismissed, but together they formed a reality that was almost impossible to question. What made this deception so powerful was not just creativity, but discipline. Every detail had to align perfectly. Soldiers wore fake unit patches and insignia, sometimes even going into nearby towns and casually dropping hints in bars where enemy spies were known to operate. They talked loudly about upcoming movements, complained about long marches, and behaved exactly as men from a real combat division would. It was theater performed under the constant threat of discovery. And everyone involved knew that one slip could unravel the entire illusion. This is where the Ghost Army truly reframed what warfare could be. Instead of asking how many tanks they had, they asked how many tanks the enemy believed they had. Instead of focusing on destruction, they focused on perception. The inflatable tanks weren't meant to fight. They were meant to be seen. They existed to occupy the enemy's mind, to force German commanders to allocate troops, fuel, and attention to places that didn't matter. while the real Allied forces prepared their next move elsewhere. By the time the Ghost Army rolled out more than 1,100 inflatable tanks and supporting decoys, they weren't just pulling pranks on the battlefield. They were executing a carefully engineered psychological operation that treated intelligence as a weapon and illusion as a strategic tool. This first layer of the story shows how a small, unconventional unit turned creativity into combat power, setting the stage for a deception so convincing that it would help shape the outcome of an entire campaign. Once the illusion was in place, the real test wasn't whether the inflatable tanks looked convincing up close, but whether they could bend the decisions being made far behind enemy lines. That's where the Ghost Army's greatest trick truly revealed its power. Their goal was never just to fool a reconnaissance pilot or confuse a patrol for a few hours. They were aiming higher, targeting the minds of German commanders who were trying to make sense of a fast-moving battlefield with incomplete information. And remarkably, it worked. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, timing became everything. A single delayed response could mean the difference between a successful advance and a bloody stalemate. By creating the appearance of massive troop concentrations in the wrong places, the Ghost Army forced German planners into a constant state of uncertainty. They saw armored divisions where there were none and heard entire corps maneuvering in the dark. And as a result, they hesitated. Divisions that should have been rushing to reinforce real front lines were instead held back, guarding against attacks that were never going to come. One of the most effective aspects of this deception was how mobile it was. Unlike fixed fortifications or static decoys, the Ghost Army could pack up an entire fake division and move it overnight. Inflatable tanks were deflated, trucks were relocated, and by the next morning, aerial photographs told a completely different story. To German intelligence, it looked as if Allied forces were shifting rapidly, probing for weak spots, preparing for major breakthroughs. This constant movement suggested strength and flexibility, qualities that commanders had to take seriously. The sound deception played a crucial role here as well. German listening posts picked up what seemed like the rumble of armored columns approaching or regrouping. At times, the noises suggested an imminent attack, prompting defensive preparations and urgent requests for reinforcements. Those reinforcements, once committed, were no longer available elsewhere. The Ghost Army wasn't just creating confusion. It was draining enemy resources by forcing them to react again and again to threats that didn't exist. Radio deception amplified this effect. Fake units didn't just appear and disappear randomly. They followed believable operational patterns. Radio traffic increased before supposed offensives and shifted as units advanced or withdrew. German analysts, trained to look for precisely these signs, read the signals as confirmation that Allied intentions were unfolding exactly as they feared. By the time they realized nothing had happened, the Ghost Army had already moved on to its next performance. The real brilliance of the operation became clear in how it shaped entire campaigns rather than isolated skirmishes. Enemy divisions were mispositioned, defensive lines were stretched thin, and critical road junctions were guarded against phantom threats. Meanwhile, actual Allied forces encountered weaker resistance where it mattered most. Advances that might have faced fierce opposition instead met disorganized defenses, buying valuable time and reducing casualties. In war, time is often more precious than territory, and the Ghost Army delivered it in abundance. What makes this achievement even more striking is how small the unit actually was. Roughly 1,100 men were influencing the movements of tens of thousands of enemy troops. They weren't winning battles by force. They were shaping the battlefield before those battles even began. German commanders weren't reacting to tanks and soldiers, but to expectations, patterns, and fears carefully planted in their intelligence systems. The Ghost Army understood that once an idea takes hold in an enemy's mind, it can be just as real as steel. By the end of the campaign, the impact was undeniable. Enemy responses had been delayed, misdirected, and in some cases completely paralyzed by uncertainty. Allied commanders, aware of the deception but often unable to publicly acknowledge it, quietly credited these operations with smoothing advances and saving lives. The Ghost Army faded back into secrecy after the war. Their work classified for decades, but the results spoke for themselves. This final piece of the story completes the picture. The inflatable tanks and fake transmissions weren't clever sideshows. They were decisive tools that influenced the course of the campaign. Through synchronized illusion and psychological pressure, a tiny, unconventional force managed to steer the enemy's decisions at the highest level. It's a reminder that in warfare, victory doesn't always belong to the strongest or the loudest, but sometimes to those who understand that what the enemy believes can matter more than what actually exists.